Many endurance athletes are more susceptible than their less well-trained and less active counterparts to upper respiratory tract infections or their related symptoms. In some cases, in particularly with endurance athletes who have a very high training load, or illness-prone athletes in particular, they may suffer 5, 6, 7 or more episodes per year. This can be very debilitating to performance, either directly influencing performance or influencing their preparation, their training, and so on. And ultimately, this can have a negative impact on their ability to perform at their optimal level. So this could be negative. And there are a number of causes and reasons for this, partly related to the volume and intensity of training that they are undertaking. So their immune system might be temporarily compromised for a number of hours, or maybe even a little bit longer, after these particularly intensive and strenuous or prolonged bouts of exercise. So immune function is temporarily suboptimal, and we refer to this as the open window period. Even if the open window periods only last for an hour or two, if you multiply this by the amount of times that these endurance athletes will be experiencing this in a typical week, then the cumulative cost is their defenses are lowered, the window is open for a substantially longer period of time. And this is one of the factors contributing to the higher incidence rate of these types of infections in endurance athletes. So the causes, the things which cause immune system to be detrimentally affected for a short period of time, you can see on the left-hand side of the screen here. So a direct consequence of things like the exercise or training that these individuals are doing, combined with the other factors, psychological, environmental, etc., that might be part and parcel of being an athlete or being an endurance athlete. So we refer to this as factors which can influence exercise-induced immunodepression and may contribute to the increased risk in athletes. It's not the whole part of the equation, however, because once the immune system is compromised, they also have to be exposed to a pathogen, a bug that can cause the illness, in order for them to suffer with that infection. And of course, on the right of the screen, you can see some additional reasons as to why athletes in general might have a higher exposure to pathogens or entry of these pathogens into the body, which again contributes to increased risk of these types of illnesses in endurance athletes. In addition to this, there are certain times of the year or season when athletes are more susceptible and illnesses tend to be a little bit higher. So the figure that you can see on the screen here is simply to illustrate the point that the seasonal variation and the cold and flu season, so the winter months, where we typically see a higher incidence rate of illness, is much more noticeable in endurance athletes. So they will be more likely to pick up illnesses in the winter months, which is of potential practical relevance and importance. So what can endurance athletes do to try and minimize the chances of picking up these illnesses, which can have a negative impact on their training and or performance? So there are a number of strategies. First and foremost, they can make sure that their training is optimally structured and optimally organized, so they have good training periodization, which means incorporation of appropriate recovery days, or the appropriate number of recovery days, and appropriate recovery in between sessions to ensure that they and their immune system are fully recovered before subsequent bouts. The other stressors, other lifestyle factors that might also contribute should also try to be kept to a minimum as well. So they can try to limit these as best as possible. They can also monitor themselves or look out for early warning signs. And some of these might be natural, internal, perceptual things that they look out for, or they might, if they have the resources available, be able to look for other markers, such as biological markers, that can help give an early indication or an early warning of when their defenses are lowered and compromised. And if they ease off in this situation, then they might allow their body a better chance to fight off the pathogen rather than allowing the pathogen to actually infect the body. And finally, they can minimize or reduce exposure. So this includes things like personal hygiene and avoiding situations where they might be increasing their contact with these pathogens that will likely cause an infection. In terms of the early warning signs, the most common ones are to look at immune markers either in blood or in the saliva. Blood samples can be useful because there is an abundance of immune cells in the blood that we can study, and they can be used to give an indication of immune status. However, the most relevant and most interesting ones are those that are most close, proximal to the upper respiratory tract. So if we can take samples such as saliva, for example, which might give an indication of immune defense and how well our immune system is able to fight off bugs, and if that is obtained from a region close to the upper respiratory tract where these pathogens might gain entry into the body, then they might be considered more relevant and more indicative of the ability of the body to fight off these potential pathogens. So we can analyze biomarkers in a number of ways. So this usually involves the collection of some type of sample. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, this might be a saliva sample. We might also be able to take blood samples. But some of these procedures are obviously quite invasive. In addition, once the samples have been collected, they of course need to be processed and either stored or analysed shortly afterwards. This can be both a time-consuming and expensive procedure to go through. As a result, this isn't always something that is readily available to many athletes. Even if it is available, the timing is very important. If the results are not available very, very quickly, and some of these measures take many days to perform, then their value as an early warning marker is not particularly useful. For an early warning marker to be of benefit, we need to have the results almost immediately. So although the research that has been conducted, where they use some of these advanced scientific methods to quantify and measure the immune system, they are very useful from a research perspective to help us understand the causes, but from a practical perspective for the athlete, they might not be that useful. In more practical terms, the athlete can understand a lot about their training status and the status of their immune system from more subjective measures and measures of how they feel and how they respond to their normal training. So things like their sleep patterns, their mood states, their resting and exercising heart rates can all give an indication as long as they know what is normal for them. So to summarize, we know that endurance athletes have an increased risk of upper respiratory illness or infection, especially during intensive training periods. They can, of course, minimize this risk via the optimal organization of their training, so good periodization, ensuring appropriate recovery and recovery days, and also looking for early warning signs. And these could be biological markers if available and if results are available rapidly, or they could be internal and markers of how they feel. The key thing is if they ease off when they notice these warning signs, it might allow the body to actually fight off the infection so they don't go on and get ill. And minimizing other factors which are within their control, such as the exposure to these pathogens, personal hygiene, etc. And finally, having good nutrition and a good diet, as discussed in the nutrition section.